The house was silent, except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick-tick-tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. The candles on the birthday cake flickered as the room's soft light seemed to shrink around them. The smell of the roast beef, golden brown and perfectly cooked, filled the air, but it went unnoticed in the stillness of the room. The table was set, its polished surface reflecting the dim glow from the chandelier overhead. Every detail was perfect. But there was no one to appreciate it. At the head of the table sat Harold Bishop, 78 years old, his silver hair neatly combed and his once strong hands folded neatly on his lap. He had chosen his best navy sweater for the occasion, the one his wife, Martha, had bought him years ago. He had even polished the silverware, a tradition he'd kept alive after she passed. Martha had always been the one to do it, to make everything perfect. But now, it was his responsibility. The house, big and empty, felt cold around him. His sons hadn't called. Not one. Not even the youngest, Marcus, who had always been the one to sneak in a phone call when he was running late. Not a word. Harold glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already 7:15. The birthday dinner was supposed to start at 6:30, but the chairs remained empty. They were late, sure, but Harold knew they wouldn't come at all. He knew at the moment he had sent out the invitations a month ago. He hadn't expected much, but this hurt. There had been a time when his house was full of noise, full of laughter, the clatter of silverware on plates, the clinking of glasses. The boys had grown up here, played in the garden, had their birthday parties, and sat around this same table for meals. Harold had watched them grow up, watched them change, and he'd always tried to be there. He had made mistakes, he knew that, but he had always tried. But now they were strangers. They hadn't come home for years, not since their mother died. And every year, Harold's birthday passed with less and less acknowledgement. A card. Maybe a brief phone call. That was it. This year, he hadn't even received that. He reached for the photo frame on the table, the one with the picture of him and his 3 sons from years ago. A younger version of himself, smiling with his arms around Marcus, Jake, and Caleb, their faces bright and full of hope. They were young then, maybe 10, 12, and 15 years old. Before life got complicated. Before the arguments, before the distance. Before everything fell apart. He stared at the photo for a long time, until his hands grew clammy, his chest tight. The memories of those days, those good days, began to twist into something else, something darker. Anger. Frustration. Regret. Harold exhaled sharply and placed the photo back on the table with deliberate care. He didn't need it anymore. He didn't need their love, or their approval. Not anymore. The clock ticked on. A sudden, strange impulse seized him. He stood up from the table, his joints creaking with the effort. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, and he could feel his heart pounding against his chest as if something big, was about to happen. He walked over to the kitchen, to the counter where the birthday cake stood. A beautiful creation, a masterpiece of layers and icing. His wife's recipe. Her hands had always made it perfect. But now, the cake was nothing more than a symbol. A symbol of a life he once knew and would never get back. Harold picked it up, carefully, his fingers tightening around the base of the cake plate. He walked toward the trash can. He wasn't even thinking, just moving, the weight of the cake in his hands almost symbolic of the weight he'd been carrying for years. He was ready to throw it all away. But just as he neared the trash can, something stopped him. He paused, the cake hovering just above the trash, his breathing shallow. His eyes were drawn to the cake, to the way the candles had melted down into the frosting, leaving behind small pools of wax. It reminded him of something he couldn't quite put his finger on. For a moment, he felt the sharp sting of loss. The absence of his wife, Martha. The absence of his sons. The emptiness that had taken over his life, creeping in over the years. But then, as quickly as the feeling had come, it disappeared. Replaced by something cold, something sharper. A plan. A twisted, vindictive idea took root in his mind, like a seed buried deep in the soil, waiting for the right moment to sprout. It wasn't about the cake, or the dinner, or the fact that his sons had abandoned him. No, it was bigger than that. It was about justice. About making them understand. Harold turned away from the trash can. He walked past the dining table and into the small study off the hallway. He paused in the doorway, his eyes falling on the desk in the corner of the room. The dark mahogany surface, the drawer that had been locked for years. It held the will, the document that had been gathering dust ever since Martha's death. He hadn't planned to change anything in the will. It had been written years ago, before everything had gone wrong, before the distance between him and his sons had grown so wide that there was no crossing it. But tonight felt different. Harold's pulse quickened as he approached the desk. He sat down in the old leather chair, the one that creaked under his weight, and pulled open the top drawer. Inside was the manila envelope, thick, slightly worn at the edges. The will. His wife's handwriting was still clear on the front, Harold Bishop's last will and testament. He ran his fingers over the envelope, feeling its weight. There was power in this. The power to make them pay for the way they had treated him. To make them feel the same abandonment, the same loneliness, he had felt for years. And what better way to do that than through this document, through something that would hold weight in court? He opened the envelope slowly, deliberately. Inside was the will, typed neatly on official paper. The words blurred in front of him as he scanned through them. The terms were clear. His assets, his house, his savings, everything had been divided among his sons equally, with the stipulation that they would receive it once they turned 30. But now, Harold's eyes glinted with a cold resolve. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled out the pen from his pocket. What if he changed it? What if he cut them out entirely? What if he made sure they never saw a penny of what he had worked for? He could do it. He could rewrite everything, leave them with nothing. Leave them with no legacy, no inheritance. All they had to do was one simple thing, show up. And they hadn't. Harold's jaw clenched as he stared at the will, his heart pounding in his chest. He would make them understand what it meant to be abandoned. He would make sure they felt it, deeply. The pen scratched across the paper. He didn't hesitate. When the ink dried, the will would be a document that would shock everyone. But first, he needed to finish what he started. The night grew colder. The shadows in Harold's study seemed to stretch out longer than they should, curling around the edges of his furniture as if they too were a reflection of his dark thoughts. He sat back in the old leather chair, still staring at the will he had just altered. His heart pounded in his chest, a constant rhythm that matched the trembling of his fingers. He hadn't expected it to feel like this, like a heavy weight in his hands, suffocating him with the burden of what he had just done. But there was no turning back now. The ink had dried. The changes were made. He had left them nothing. His sons, Jake, Caleb, and Marcus, would receive nothing. Not a penny. No house, no inheritance. The wealth he had spent a lifetime accumulating was gone for them. There was only one condition: they had to come to him, show up at his birthday dinner, face him, and show they still cared. If they didn't, they would never get a cent. Harold hadn't wanted it to go this far. But there was no other way. Years of loneliness. Years of disappointment. Years of watching his sons drift further and further away. And all it had taken was one forgotten birthday to push him over the edge. He stuffed the will back into the manila envelope and closed it with a snap. The sound felt final, like the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle falling into place, the image now clear and undeniable. He placed the envelope back into the drawer and locked it. The house was eerily silent again, the kind of silence that could either bring peace or unnerve the soul. His breath came in shallow gasps. A part of him wondered if this was what he had been waiting for all these years, the moment when he could make them understand how it felt to be forgotten, to be pushed aside. But another part of him felt uneasy. The clock ticked louder now, each second echoing through the empty halls. Harold stood up, his legs stiff from the long sitting. His joints creaked in protest as he walked to the window. The street outside was quiet, dark. There was nothing there but the hum of the distant highway, the occasional flash of headlights from passing cars. It felt like the calm before a storm. What if they didn't come? What if this was all for nothing? He shook his head. No. They would come. They had to. They had to face him. He was their father, after all. And a part of him, a tiny, bitter part, still wanted to believe that they would come. Maybe not out of love, but out of obligation. They owed him that much. He glanced down at his wrist. The watch, once a gift from his oldest son, Caleb, was there, resting against his skin like an old friend. A reminder of a time when Caleb had cared. But that time was long gone. It had been over a year since Caleb had last visited. And even when he did, it was brief, barely an hour, a coffee, a forced conversation. And then, he was gone again. Harold couldn't remember the last time they had shared a real meal, laughed together, or even sat in the same room for more than a few minutes. Jake, the middle son, was no better. He had always been the rebel, the one who fought against authority, against rules. But he had promised to come to Harold's birthday a few years ago, and then just never showed up. No explanation. No apology. Just silence. And Marcus. Marcus had been the hardest. The youngest. The one who had always seemed the most attached to Harold, the one who had asked about his day, who had called to check on him. But even Marcus had faded away in the last few years, consumed by his own life, his own dreams. He had moved across the country, built a life that Harold could hardly recognize. Every call was brief, every visit a fleeting memory. But tonight would change that. Tonight, they would see him. They would answer for the years of neglect. He wasn't sure when he had begun to feel so angry. It had started small, a missed call here, an ignored message there, but it had built over time. Each little slight had chipped away at him until there was nothing left but this rage. It was nearly midnight when Harold finally climbed into bed, the weight of the evening's decision pressing down on his chest. But sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight. His mind kept circling back to the will. The changes. What would happen when his sons saw it? Would they come, angry and ready to confront him? Or would they simply shrug and walk away, as they always had? His eyes wandered to the window, where the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light across the yard. There was a sudden sound, like the soft rustling of footsteps in the hallway. Harold sat up in bed, his heart racing. He strained his ears, listening. Nothing. It was probably just the house settling, the creak of an old floorboard, or the wind rustling the trees outside. But Harold couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was coming. Something was shifting in the air. The following day was even more unsettling than the night before. Harold spent the entire morning pacing the house, occasionally glancing at the clock. Every time he passed the dining table, his eyes lingered on the empty chairs, the untouched birthday cake, and the still, silent house. He couldn't shake the feeling that the atmosphere was somehow different, more oppressive, more intense. He hadn't told anyone about the changes to the will. It wasn't something that could be discussed over the phone or in passing. It was a decision that could only be revealed when they were face to face, when he could see their reactions. The thought of it thrilled him, but it also terrified him. The power he now held over them felt intoxicating, but at the same time, it felt like a curse. By mid-afternoon, there was still no word from any of his sons. Harold tried to busy himself with small chores around the house, fixing a leaky faucet, rearranging the bookshelves, but it didn't help. He felt a gnawing emptiness in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing feeling that he couldn't quite place. Then, at 3:30 p.m., his phone rang. Harold picked it up on the second ring, his heart skipping a beat. It was Caleb. "Dad," Caleb's voice crackled through the line, sounding strained, like he was distracted, like he had something important on his mind. "Hey. I got your invitation for tonight. We're not coming." There was a long pause. "Why not?" Harold's voice cracked, but he didn't care. His grip on the phone tightened. I don't know, Dad. It doesn't feel right, you know? Things have been so weird between us. It's too late for us to fix things. It's just too late." And with that, Caleb hung up. Harold stood there, the phone still pressed to his ear, the words echoing in his mind. It's too late. The phone call with Caleb echoed in Harold's mind long after the line had gone dead. His hand, still clutching the receiver, shook slightly, though he wasn't sure if it was from anger or disappointment. Perhaps both. Too late. The words repeated in his mind like a mantra, each repetition driving a deeper wedge between Harold and the life he had once shared with his sons. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he made the changes to the will. Maybe a confrontation, maybe a show of guilt, or even defiance. But this was worse. Caleb had been his last hope. The youngest had always been the most sensitive, the one who had looked up to Harold the most, even when everything had fallen apart. But now, Caleb was gone too. Lost in the whirlwind of his own life, just like Jake and Marcus. Harold put the phone down slowly, almost reverently, as if it had burned him. He sat there for a moment, staring at the empty kitchen around him. The silence in the house pressed down on him, thicker than it had been just an hour before. It felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in, rejecting him. He stood up abruptly, almost knocking over a chair in the process, and walked to the window. The daylight outside was fading, a soft pink hue brushing the horizon as the sun set. It had been a long, lonely day, and soon, the night would fall, bringing with it the weight of what he had done. He couldn't understand it. Why? Why had they abandoned him? Each year, each phone call, each visit felt more distant, more hollow. And now, Caleb, the one he thought might still care, had turned his back. Harold gripped the window frame, the glass cool against his palm. And yet, something inside of him, a dark, stubborn part of him, felt a flicker of satisfaction. This was what it had come to. They had made their choices. Now, Harold was making his. But the satisfaction was fleeting. The more he thought about it, the more he questioned what he had done. Was this justice? Was this what he had wanted? The weight of his decision began to press on his chest again, harder this time, and he found himself struggling to breathe. Late evening. By the time the clock struck 7, Harold found himself standing in the dining room once more. The table was set, the same as it had been the night before. The birthday cake still sat there, the candles long extinguished, the wax remnants frozen in time. The room, which had once been a place of celebration, now felt like a tomb. He hadn't expected anyone to show up. Not really. Caleb's call had confirmed that. But a part of him still hoped, still held on to the faintest shred of optimism. Maybe Jake would show up. Maybe Marcus would make the drive down from the city. But as the minutes ticked by, and the house remained as silent as it had been all day, Harold began to feel something else creeping into his bones, a strange kind of dread. What if no one ever came back? He had heard stories of families like his, fractured by years of neglect and bitterness. He knew the reality. It was hard for families to stay close once the cracks began to appear. But this was different. This wasn't just time or distance keeping them apart. This was a deliberate breaking, a choice, a consequence of the years of mistakes on both sides. Harold knew he hadn't been perfect. Far from it. But neither had his sons. A flash of movement caught his eye. He turned quickly, but it was only a shadow passing across the front lawn, nothing more. Harold felt his stomach twist. He couldn't explain it, but the house felt alive now, in a way it hadn't before. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering of things long buried. The secrets, the lies, the failures that had accumulated over the years. The house had once been full of life, laughter, arguments, and passion. But now, it was empty. So empty. His heart clenched painfully in his chest, and for the first time in days. Harold felt the tears come. They were hot, heavy, and unexpected. He didn't even try to stop them. He simply stood there, in the silence of the room, and let them fall. The first knock. The knock on the door startled Harold, pulling him out of his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, just a soft knock, almost tentative, but it was enough to make him stand straighter, to quicken his pulse. Could it be? He rushed to the door, his hands trembling as he reached for the knob. When he opened it, he half expected to see one of his sons standing there, their face full of guilt, ready to make amends. But no. It wasn't Caleb. It wasn't Jake. It wasn't Marcus. It was a stranger. A man he didn't recognize, dressed in a dark suit, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry to intrude," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Are you Mr. Harold Bishop?" Harold blinked in confusion. "Yes." "Who are you?" The man extended his hand, his expression neutral but firm. "My name is Thomas Carrington. I'm here on behalf of your sons." Thomas Carrington? The name didn't sound familiar. But before Harold could say anything else, the man continued. "I've been instructed to deliver this to you," Carrington said, holding out an envelope with Harold's name written on it in neat handwriting. Harold hesitated before taking the envelope. His heart pounded, his hands feeling clammy. It felt heavier than it should. "Thank you," Harold muttered, still confused. "What is this? Is this from one of my sons?" Carrington nodded. "Yes, Mr. Bishop. From your sons. They weren't able to come tonight, but they wanted to make sure you received this." The man paused, as if measuring his next words carefully. It's important." Harold nodded, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what to make of this. He hadn't seen or heard from any of his sons in over a year. And now, this mysterious man was showing up with a letter. "I see," Harold replied, his voice tight. "Thank you. Please let them know." But the man was already gone, disappearing into the night like a ghost. The letter. Harold closed the door slowly and stood in the hallway for a moment, the envelope still in his hand. His breath came in shallow gasps. Something about the whole situation felt off, like he had stepped into the middle of something he didn't understand. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he tore open the envelope, the paper inside crinkling softly. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. The handwriting was familiar, Marcus's. "Dear Dad. We know you're angry. We know you've been hurt, and honestly, we can't blame you. We've been terrible sons. We've ignored you. We've let our lives drift away from yours. But we can't change the past, and neither can you. The truth is, none of us knew how to fix what was broken. We thought time would heal things, but it didn't. We thought we could just keep going, pretending like nothing had happened. But it's clear now that we were wrong. We're not asking for your forgiveness. We're not even asking you to forget. But we want you to know that we haven't forgotten you. And we won't forget you. Please understand that we did try. We really did. And if it's not too late, we want to try again. We'll come when you're ready. But we need time. With love. Caleb, Jake, and Marcus." Harold's hands shook as he finished reading. The letter fell from his grip, fluttering to the floor. His mind reeled. They weren't coming. Not now, not tonight. They hadn't even tried. The room seemed smaller now, as if the walls were closing in on him. Harold stood frozen in the hallway, his eyes fixed on the letter that had fallen to the floor. The words from his sons echoed in his mind, each line a cruel reminder of everything he had lost and everything he was trying to hold on to. "We know you're angry. We can't blame you." Anger. That was what they thought. They thought it was just anger. But Harold knew the truth, what he felt wasn't simply anger. It was a bitter, gnawing emptiness, the kind that only years of abandonment could create. It was a grief he couldn't bury anymore, a grief that clawed at him every time he saw the empty chairs at the table, the vacant spaces where his sons used to sit, laugh, and share their lives. "Please understand that we did try. We really did." Harold clenched his fists, his fingers digging into his palms. They tried? What did that even mean? How had they tried? He hadn't seen any of them in months, no visits, no phone calls. They had moved on with their lives, pretending that everything was fine, and now they were telling him they had tried? It was insulting. It was infuriating. And it was all the more painful because a part of him still wanted to believe them. A part of him still wanted to believe they cared. He knelt down and picked up the letter, the paper crinkling softly in his hand. He read the words again, slower this time, allowing the weight of each sentence to sink in. The words were clear, almost too clear. And yet, they made no sense. His sons had abandoned him for years, and now, they were asking for his forgiveness. But not yet. "We'll come when you're ready." Harold stared at the words, his mind spinning. What did that even mean? They would come when he was ready? What did they expect him to do, just wait for them? He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep waiting for them to show up, for them to come back and pretend that nothing had changed. He stood up abruptly, the letter still clutched in his hand. The house was suffocating him now. He could feel the walls closing in, the silence pressing against his chest. It was too much. Everything was too much. Late that night, Harold sat at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the cold surface, the light from a single bulb overhead casting long shadows across the room. He had been sitting there for hours, replaying the same thoughts over and over in his head. The words from the letter. Caleb's phone call. The sound of the door closing when the mysterious man had left. Nothing made sense anymore. And yet, somehow, everything felt more connected now than it ever had been. He hadn't heard from his sons in a year, and now they were sending him letters, making excuses, pretending to care. It felt like an elaborate game, one that he had no desire to play. The silence was unbearable. He couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in this endless waiting game. But at the same time, there was another part of him, a part he hated, that still longed for them. For Caleb's smile, for Jake's rebellious grin, for Marcus's quiet, thoughtful presence. It was a part of him that still believed, deep down, that they would come back. But even that part of him was starting to fade, like a dying ember. There was a knock on the door. Harold's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. His mind raced. Who could it be now? He had already received the letter. There was no reason for anyone else to show up. Was it one of his sons finally? He stood up quickly, his legs stiff from hours of sitting, and hurried to the door. When he opened it, he didn't expect to see who was standing there. It was a woman. Early 30s, dark hair, eyes sharp but weary. She wore a dark coat and stood with an air of quiet urgency. "Can I help you?" Harold asked, his voice tight. There was something about her that felt off, like she wasn't just a random stranger. "I'm sorry to intrude, Mr. Bishop," the woman said. Her voice was calm, but there was a subtle hint of something unsettling beneath it. My name is Evelyn. Evelyn Carrington. Harold's brow furrowed. Carrington? He didn't recognize the name, but something about it tugged at him. Who are you? Evelyn's gaze hardened for a moment before she spoke again. I'm here on behalf of your sons. His sons. Harold's stomach twisted. Was this another one of their strange games? Another cryptic message? They've asked me to come. They've left you something. Harold's breath caught in his throat. What more could they possibly have for him? What else could they possibly want? He clenched his fists at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't understand, Harold said slowly. They've already sent me a letter. What else is there? Evelyn hesitated, glancing down at the ground as if she were gathering the right words. It's not just a letter, Mr. Bishop, she said softly. They've left you something they want you to have. But they want to be sure you understand what it means first. She handed him an envelope. This one was different. This wasn't a simple note like the one from before. It was thick, sealed with wax. Something about it felt official, important. Please, Evelyn said, her voice low. Read it. And when you're ready, we can talk. Harold took the envelope from her, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't know why. But something about Evelyn's presence unsettled him. She wasn't just another messenger. There was something more here, something hidden beneath the surface. He nodded and stepped back, closing the door behind him. Evelyn stood there for a moment, her eyes studying him, before turning and walking away, disappearing into the night. The envelope. Harold sat back down at the kitchen table, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The letter in his hands felt heavier now, as though it contained more than just words. He had already read the letter from his sons, but this felt different. He could feel the weight of it in his bones. He carefully broke the wax seal, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. The paper inside was thicker, heavier than he expected. As he unfolded it, a single sheet of paper fell into his lap. The writing was different from the letter his sons had sent. This handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, deliberate. The letter read, Harold. This is the last thing I can do for you, for us. What you have been given, what you will soon read, is not just a gift. It is a key. A key to everything you've been searching for. You have made choices, and so have we. But understand this, nothing is as it seems. You may think your sons have forgotten you. You may think they have abandoned you, and perhaps, in some ways, you are right. But there is something else. Something you are not seeing. We have been watching. We have been waiting for you to make the right decision, to choose the right path. But this is not the end. It is only the beginning. Harold sat there, stunned, unable to process the words. His mind raced. Who had written this? What did it mean? Was this some kind of twisted game? His sons, had they orchestrated this? Was this just another layer of their betrayal? But then, the final words sank in. We have been watching. We have been waiting for you to make the right decision. The word seemed to echo in his mind, drowning out everything else. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. And Harold didn't know if he was ready to face whatever it was. The phone rang again, shattering the silence. Harold stared at the phone, the shrill ringing piercing through the silence of the house. He hadn't touched it yet, as if the mere idea of answering was something too momentous to face. It felt as if everything had been leading up to this moment. The letter. Evelyn Carrington. The cryptic words that had both haunted and confused him. What more could they want? He had no answers. He had no plan. All he had was this weight, this growing, suffocating weight in his chest, that seemed to swell with each unanswered question. The phone rang again, and Harold felt a chill spread through his spine. He reached for the receiver slowly, as if it might bite. But when he finally lifted it, his hand was steady, his heart pounding louder than the call. "Hello?" Harold's voice was rough, unfamiliar to his own ears. "Harold? It's Caleb." The voice on the other end was unmistakable. His son. But there was something different about the way Caleb spoke now, an unfamiliar edge to his tone. The warmth that had once been there was gone, replaced by something colder. "Caleb?" Harold whispered, almost as if he couldn't believe it. "Is this really you?" There was a long pause before Caleb responded. "Yes. It's me." Harold sat down, his knees buckling beneath him. His breath quickened. This wasn't the call he had been expecting. It wasn't the reunion he had dreamed of. Something was wrong. There was an unease in Caleb's voice that made Harold's stomach churn. "I got your letter," Harold said, his voice shaky. "I don't understand. What's going on? Why all of this?" Caleb sighed heavily, and the silence on the other end stretched long. "Dad, I don't know how to say this. But everything's changed. And it's not just us. It's not just the three of us. There's more to this than you think." Harold's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, more? What's happening, Caleb?" Another long pause. Harold could hear Caleb's ragged breathing as if he were trying to find the right words. The air felt thick, and Harold could barely breathe. "Dad," Caleb said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how much you can take. But you need to hear this. You need to know that it wasn't just us who walked away. It wasn't just us who abandoned you." Harold's head was spinning. His mind raced to keep up with Caleb's words, to make sense of them. "What are you talking about? What wasn't just you? Who else is there?" "It's the will. And Evelyn Carrington. She's part of it. She's been involved from the beginning. From the moment you changed it, Dad. She's been controlling everything. And so have they." Harold's pulse thudded in his ears. "What do you mean, they?" Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. "Dad, there's so much you don't know. So much you're not seeing. You're not alone in this. There are people who've been manipulating everything from the start, pulling the strings. And they're not just trying to get you. They're trying to control all of us." Harold's grip on the phone tightened. His fingers were numb, but he couldn't let go. He was drowning, sinking deeper with each word Caleb said. The letter. Evelyn Carrington. The cryptic message. It was all coming together, but in a way he couldn't understand. "Caleb, stop," Harold said, panic creeping into his voice. "What do you mean? Who's been pulling the strings? Why didn't you tell me this before? Why now?" "Because it's too late," Caleb replied, his voice breaking. "Dad, I've been trying to warn you. I've been trying to reach you for months. But it wasn't until recently that I figured it out, what's really been going on." Harold's mind spun in 1,000 directions. What was Caleb saying? Who were these people? What had Harold done by changing the will, by severing his ties with them? What kind of mess had he gotten himself into? "I don't understand. Who's behind this, Caleb?" Harold asked desperately. Caleb's voice cracked, the words barely audible. "The will, Dad. The one you changed, it wasn't just about money. It was about control. And the reason we've been pushed away? It's all connected to what you did with that will. You sealed our fate. You sealed yours." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating Harold. He stood up, pacing around the kitchen, the walls closing in on him. What had he done? "You're not making sense," Harold finally said, his voice trembling with frustration. "What do you mean? What fate?" "Dad, it's not just about you. It's about everything you've built. The people involved, they're not just after money. They're after power. They're after control. And you've played right into their hands. Harold's head was spinning, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. There was something bigger at play here, something more sinister than he had ever imagined. Who are they, Caleb? Harold gasped. Who's behind this? Who's trying to control us? There was a long silence. Then Caleb spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. The Carringtons. The Carringtons. Harold's blood ran cold. The name sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard of the Carrington family before, but only in whispers. Rich. Powerful. Unseen. They had their fingers in everything, business, politics, even the law. But Harold never imagined that they would be involved in his life. How could they? What connection did they have with him? What did they want? Caleb, Harold said, his voice shaking. What are you saying? Are you telling me that these people, this family, are behind everything? Yes, Caleb said, his voice hollow. They've been watching us for years. Watching you. Watching all of us. And they've been pulling the strings. The will. Everything. They're the ones who've been manipulating us. Harold's breath caught in his throat. The weight of it all was too much to process. This wasn't just about his sons. It wasn't just about the broken relationships. This was bigger. This was a conspiracy, a web of lies and manipulation that spanned far beyond his comprehension. He needed answers. He needed to know more. But it felt as if he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking into an abyss, not knowing if he would ever be able to climb back up. Where are you? Harold demanded, his voice desperate. Caleb, please. Where are you right now? I need to see you. We need to talk. I can't, Dad, Caleb replied, his voice strained. It's not safe. They're watching. You have to be careful. They're going to come for you next. Harold's heart skipped a beat. Who? The Carringtons? Yes, Caleb whispered. They want you to suffer for what you did. For the will. They'll stop at nothing. Harold's eyes widened in realization. This was it. His entire life had been leading up to this moment. The broken relationships. The decisions he had made. The will. The consequences were finally catching up with him, and they were more dangerous than he could have imagined. Dad, listen to me, Caleb's voice was urgent. You have to act fast. You have to take control before it's too late. Harold's hands were shaking now, the phone slipping slightly from his grip. What do I do, Caleb? What can I do? Find out who they really are. Find out what they want. And don't trust anyone. Not even me. The silence after the call. Harold's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was certain, his world was crumbling. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the image they created was a nightmare. The Carringtons had been manipulating everything. And now, they were coming for him. He hung up the phone, his hands shaking, his pulse racing. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. He wasn't even sure who to trust anymore. The days following the phone call with Caleb felt like an endless blur of dread and uncertainty. Harold had barely slept, his mind racing through every conversation, every letter, every cryptic word that had ever been spoken to him. His thoughts had become a tangled mess of fears and suspicions, none of which made sense, yet all of them seemed to point toward the same, terrifying conclusion: the Carrington family was far more involved in his life than he could have ever imagined. And they were waiting. The shadows in his house grew longer each day, like the walls were closing in, suffocating him. Each tick of the clock echoed in his ears like a countdown. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something something catastrophic. But the problem was, Harold didn't know what it was. What did the Carringtons want from him? What had he done that was so unforgivable? He was on the verge of cracking when the doorbell rang again. That morning. Harold opened the door cautiously, his heart thumping in his chest. Was it Caleb? Was it another warning? A figure stood in the doorway, but this time it wasn't the unfamiliar woman Evelyn Carrington. It wasn't Caleb either. It was someone far more unexpected. Harold, a deep voice rumbled. Harold's heart dropped as he recognized the man standing before him. The man was tall, well-built, with sharp features, and his eyes bore into Harold's with an intensity that felt like it could see right through him. Michael Carrington, Harold whispered under his breath, his throat going dry. The name alone sent a shiver down his spine. This was the last person Harold ever thought would stand on his doorstep. Michael Carrington was the patriarch of the Carrington family, a man who was rarely seen in public but whose name commanded both power and fear. The silence between them stretched thick and heavy. Harold stood frozen, unsure what to do. Michael Carrington was a legend, a figurehead in an empire built on manipulation and deceit. Harold had never dared to even think of confronting him. But now, here he was. "You're probably wondering what this is all about, Harold," Michael Carrington said in his low, measured voice. He didn't smile, but there was a certain coldness in his expression, as if he were amused by the situation. I don't understand," Harold said, his voice unsteady. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" Michael stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation. His presence was suffocating, overwhelming. "I want to explain everything," Michael said calmly, glancing around the foyer as though taking inventory of the place. "I want to make sure you understand why things are the way they are. And more importantly, why they'll never change." Harold felt his pulse race. This wasn't a conversation he had prepared for, and the weight of the situation felt too much to bear. He wanted to refuse, to demand answers, but something deep inside him told him that this conversation was inevitable. This was the moment that would define everything. "Why don't we sit down?" Michael suggested, gesturing toward the living room. Harold's legs felt weak, but he nodded. He led Michael into the living room and sat across from him, his hands trembling in his lap. He could feel the tension in the room, thick like fog. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but his throat was tight with fear. Michael Carrington leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. His gaze never left Harold's face. "You've been a part of something much bigger than you realize, Harold. For years, you've been at the center of a game that was never about money, never about your sons. It was always about control." Harold blinked, trying to comprehend. "Control? I don't understand. What are you talking about?" Michael's lips curled into a cold smile, his eyes hardening. "You, Harold, are more important than you think. You've been a pawn in a much larger scheme. But not just any pawn. You've been a key player. The will you changed, it wasn't just a family dispute. It was never about who got what or who didn't. It was a test." "A test?" Harold echoed, his head spinning. "What test?" Michael leaned forward, his voice lowering to a whisper. "A test of loyalty. A test of survival." Harold's mind raced. None of this made sense. Why him? Why had they involved him in whatever this was? "I didn't ask for any of this," Harold muttered, his voice growing quieter. "I just wanted my family back. I just wanted things to go back to the way they were." "You still don't get it, do you?" Michael's voice was almost sympathetic now, but it held an edge. "You've never understood what's really at stake. And now it's too late to turn back." Harold's chest tightened. "Too late," he whispered. "What do you mean?" Michael's cold smile deepened. "You've already made your choice, Harold. When you changed the will, you sealed your fate. And the fate of your sons. Fate? Harold repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. What are you saying? What did I do? Michael stood and walked to the window, staring out at the overcast sky. What you don't understand, Harold, is that the Carringtons never leave anything to chance. Everything is orchestrated. Every move, every decision, even the ones you think are yours. Everything is part of a grand design. Harold felt a sharp pain in his chest. He could hardly breathe, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. But, why me? Why my sons? Michael turned back toward him, his gaze sharp and calculating. Because, Harold, you were the key. You were the final piece of the puzzle. You were the last test for Caleb, Jake, and Marcus. The decision you made with the will wasn't just a decision for your family, it was a decision for all of us. It was about power. And survival. Harold stared at him in disbelief, struggling to keep his composure. So everything that's happened, was because of some test. Because of some game you're playing? Michael's face darkened. Not a game. A necessity. In our world, there are no accidents, no random choices. Every action has a consequence. Your sons, they've been pawns too. But they were never meant to inherit what you thought they would. That was just part of the illusion. Why are you telling me this now? Harold's voice was barely above a whisper. What do you want from me? Michael took a step closer. What I want, Harold, is simple. I want you to understand that this is over. The Carringtons control everything. You may think you're in charge, but the truth is, your sons never stood a chance. They've already made their decisions. Now, it's your turn. Harold's world seemed to implode. His sons, his flesh and blood, had been pawns in a game he hadn't even known existed. He had thought they had been distant, that they had abandoned him. But now, Michael was telling him that they had been caught in something far darker, far more dangerous. Something that had manipulated every choice they made. Michael watched him closely, as if waiting for him to process the enormity of the truth. You're free to go, Michael said finally, his voice suddenly colder. But remember, Harold. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, you will never be free of the Carringtons. You will never escape what's been set in motion. Harold's mind was reeling. He stood up abruptly, his legs shaky beneath him. What do I do now? He asked, his voice breaking. What's the point of all this? I can't fix it. I can't undo what's been done. Michael's lips curled into a final, chilling smile. You can't. But you will learn to live with it. And with that, Michael Carrington turned and walked toward the door, leaving Harold standing in the silence of his own shattered world.